I stood at the bank counter, holding my wife's death certificate, when the clerk whispered, "This account requires her signature." It was 9:17 a.m., 3 days after the funeral. My wife had gone there every Tuesday for 38 years. I'd never asked why. The screen flashed a balance. Then a second name, one I'd never seen. I didn't argue with the bank clerk. I couldn't. Her voice had dropped instinctively. The way people speak when they sense they've stepped into something they shouldn't have. I just nodded and slid the death certificate back into my folder, suddenly aware of how thin the paper felt for something that was supposed to explain the absence of a whole person. My wife, Elaine, had handled our finances for decades. I told myself that was normal. She was better with numbers. I trusted her. Trust had been easy when she was alive. Outside the bank, I sat in my car longer than I meant to. The parking lot looked the same as it always had. Ordinary, dull, safe, that made what I just heard feel unreal, like the clerk had mistaken me for someone else. A second name. I repeated it silently, trying to remember if I'd ever heard Elaine mention it. I hadn't. That absence began to itch, the way a memory does when you know something is missing but can't place what at home. The house still smelled faintly of the casserole someone had dropped off after the funeral. I hadn't thrown anything away yet. Elaine's coat hung by the door. Her shoes were lined up neatly, as if she might step into them any moment. I placed the folder on the dining table and sat across from it, hands folded, waiting for some internal permission to open it again. I didn't feel grief the way I expected. I felt watched, as if the house itself knew something I didn't. Elaine and I had been married for 41 years. We met young, struggled together, raised our son, buried her parents, planned a retirement we never quite reached. Every Tuesday morning, without fail, she'd dress carefully and say she had errands. Sometimes she brought home a receipt from the grocery store. Sometimes she didn't. I never questioned it. A marriage that long runs on assumptions more than conversations. That thought landed heavier than I liked. I went to her desk in the spare room, the one she called her paper corner. Everything was labeled in her careful handwriting. Insurance, utilities, taxes. I opened each drawer slowly, respecting an order that suddenly felt ceremonial. In the back, beneath old checkbooks, I found a slim envelope. It wasn't labeled. Inside was a single deposit slip, dated years ago, with the same bank logo from that morning. The account number was partially blacked out. My pulse picked up, not from fear exactly, but from recognition. I sat back and tried to remember the last Tuesday she'd gone. The morning was clear. She'd kissed my cheek and reminded me about taking the trash out. Ordinary words. Safe words. I wondered if she'd already known she wouldn't be coming back. If that knowledge had sat between us like a glass wall I never noticed. The idea made my throat tighten. I wasn't ready to accuse her of anything. I just wanted to understand. The phone rang, sharp in the quiet house. It startled me enough that I knocked the envelope to the floor. It was our son checking in, asking if I'd eaten. I lied and said yes. He sounded relieved, distracted, already stepping back into his own life. I didn't tell him about the bank. I didn't know why. Maybe I needed this confusion to belong to me first. That afternoon I returned to the bank, this time asking only for general information. Policies. Procedures. The manager spoke kindly but carefully, explaining privacy rules, repeating that without Elaine's authorization or a court order, there was little they could say. He mentioned almost as an afterthought that some clients maintained long-term arrangements for specific reasons. The way he said reasons made my stomach drop. It wasn't neutral. It carried weight. Driving home, I realized something that unsettled me more than the mystery itself. Elaine had never missed a Tuesday. Not during illness, not during storms, not even when our son was in the hospital years ago, and we were barely sleeping. That consistency which I once admired now felt deliberate, protective, as if she'd been guarding something fragile and dangerous at the same time. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. I tried to picture Elaine as I'd known her. Patient, practical, gentle. I tried to imagine her keeping a secret for nearly 4 decades. The two images refused to overlap. Somewhere between them was a truth I hadn't earned yet, one that waited behind locked doors and polite smiles. I understood then that whatever Elaine had been doing every Tuesday, it hadn't been small, and it hadn't ended with her death. I woke before dawn with the same thought pressing against my chest that had followed me to bed. Elaine had built a life that ran parallel to mine, and I had never noticed the traffic between them. The house was silent, the kind of silence that only exists after loss, when even familiar noises feel like intrusions. I made coffee. I barely drank and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten, waiting for courage to catch up with curiosity. I decided not to go back to the bank right away. Something told me answers wouldn't come from counters or policies. Ellen had been meticulous, but she was also human. Humans leave traces where they feel safest. I went back to her desk, this time less reverent, more desperate. I pulled out folders, stacked them, restacked them, trying to see patterns instead of labels. That was when I noticed a gap on the shelf, a clean strip of wood where dust should have been. Behind a row of old cookbooks in the kitchen, I found a thin ledger wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. My name wasn't on it. Neither was hers. The pages were filled with dates and numbers, written in pencil, careful but not neat. Some entries had initials I didn't recognize. Others were just amounts always deposited on Tuesdays. My hands trembled as I flipped through it, realizing the record stretched back further than our son's birth. The doorbell rang. I nearly dropped the ledger. A neighbor stood outside with a container she wanted returned. I thanked her, exchanged pleasantries, and felt like an actor reading lines from a script Elaine had written. When the door closed, I locked it, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt, as if secrets had weight and mine were stacked against the walls. I spent the rest of the morning trying to reconstruct a timeline without using dates in my head. I remembered Elaine coming home tired some Tuesdays, quiet on others. I remembered arguments we'd never finished because they didn't seem important enough. I remembered trusting that whatever she carried she'd share when it mattered. That trust now felt like negligence, not malicious, just incurious. By midday I called the number listed on one of the older deposit slips I'd found. It rang twice before a man answered, his voice guarded. When I said Elaine's name, there was a pause long enough to measure. He asked who I was. I told him. He didn't hang up, but he didn't invite me in either. He said he'd heard about her passing. The way he said passing sounded practiced, like a phrase used often in careful conversations. He told me Elaine had helped people. That was his exact wording. When I asked how, he said he couldn't explain over the phone. He suggested meeting somewhere neutral, a cafe across town. He named a time later that afternoon. I agreed before I could reconsider. When the call ended, I realized my hands were shaking again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that Elaine's secret had a voice. The cafe was busy enough to feel anonymous. The man sat with his back to the window, eyes scanning the room before settling on me. He looked ordinary, which somehow made everything worse. He spoke quietly, telling me Elaine had been part of something unofficial, something that existed in the spaces institutions ignored. People came to her because she didn't ask questions that would hurt them. She collected money, held it, moved it when needed. He stopped short of calling it illegal. I asked why Tuesdays. He smiled. A sad, tired expression. Tuesdays were predictable, he said. Less scrutiny, less noise. Elaine understood systems the way some people understand weather. She knew when storms passed unnoticed. I asked about the second name on the account. His expression hardened. He said that name wasn't supposed to surface yet. We parted without resolution. Back in my car, I felt the weight of implication pressing down. Elaine hadn't been stealing. She hadn't been hiding money from me. Out of greed, she'd been protecting something, or someone, over a span of time long enough to become identity. That distinction mattered, but it didn't bring relief. It raised the stakes. At home, I noticed the answering machine blinking. One message. A woman's voice I didn't recognize. Calm but urgent, saying she needed to speak to Elaine and that it couldn't wait. She left a number and added, almost as an afterthought, that Tuesdays were running out. I sat down slowly, understanding for the first time that Elaine's death hadn't ended her obligations. It had transferred them, and I was now standing in the open space she'd kept hidden. I replayed the message twice more, listening for tone, for threat, for familiarity. There was none, just certainty. I wrote the number down but didn't call it. Not yet. I needed to understand the shape of what Elaine had carried before I let anyone else see me. Holding it, I walked through the house, opening closets, checking boxes, finding nothing else overt. That absence felt intentional, like she'd trusted only herself with the full picture. As evening settled, a realization settled with it. Elaine had chosen me as her blind spot, not because she doubted me, but because she needed one place in her life that stayed uncomplicated. That thought hurt more than any suspicion. It suggested love built on separation, care expressed through exclusion. I wondered how many times she'd sat across from me, listening. When darkness finally filled the rooms, I sat at the table again with the ledger, the death certificate, and the slip of paper with the phone number. None of it fit together yet, but it was forming a perimeter. Somewhere outside that perimeter were people who expected Elaine, not me. They would not wait forever. And for the first time since the funeral, I understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. I called the number from the answering machine, just as the sky outside shifted into that muted gray between afternoon and evening. The woman answered on the first ring, as if she had been holding the phone, waiting. She said my name before I introduced myself. That alone tightened something in my chest. I told her Elaine had passed. There was a pause, controlled, almost respectful, then a quiet acknowledgement. She didn't apologize. She said she was sorry for the timing. That choice of words told me everything about how she viewed this moment. She asked if we could meet. Not tomorrow. Not later in the week. She named a place and an hour close enough that refusal would have sounded like avoidance. I agreed, then immediately wondered if that was what Elaine would have done, or if I was already improvising in ways that could cost me. The woman ended the call by saying Elaine trusted me. I stared at the phone long after it went dark, trying to decide if that was reassurance or leverage. The place she chose was a public library with a small cafe tucked inside, the kind of space designed to discourage raised voices and impulsive decisions. She was already seated when I arrived, hands folded around a paper cup, posture straight, eyes steady. She looked younger than I expected, but tired in a way that suggested long vigilance. She introduced herself by her first name only. I noticed she never once asked how I was holding up. She told me Elaine had been the anchor. That was the word she used. Without Elaine, things drifted. People panicked. Money moved too fast, or not at all. I asked why Elaine. The woman said Elaine had credibility that came from consistency. 38 years of showing up on the same day, at the same time, without fail. That kind of reliability created trust, where contracts couldn't. I felt a flash of pride immediately followed by resentment. This was the part of Elaine I had never known. When I asked about the second name on the account, the woman's jaw tightened. She said that name represented contingency, a safeguard in case Elaine couldn't act. I realized then that my name wasn't on it. I asked why. She didn't answer directly. She said Elaine believed protection only worked if it was invisible. She believed involving me would create a vulnerability. Hearing that felt like discovering a locked door inside a room I thought I owned. The woman slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies, agreements written in plain language, lists of amounts and initials. Nothing overtly criminal. Nothing clean either. It was a web of quiet favors, temporary holds and transfers designed to help people avoid collapse when systems failed them. Elaine hadn't profited. She'd stabilized. The woman said that balance was now gone. Some people wanted their money immediately. Others wanted answers. All of them wanted certainty. I asked what they wanted from me. The woman met my eyes and said, they wanted continuity. They wanted me to authorize releases. Elaine had delayed. They wanted me to assume her role until a transition could be arranged. I laughed once, sharply, then stopped when I realized she wasn't joking. I told her I wasn't qualified. She said Elaine had anticipated that reaction. That was why the second name existed. That was why certain instructions were sealed. Back at home, I searched for those instructions with new urgency. I wasn't looking for money anymore. I was looking for intent, in the bottom drawer of Elaine's desk. Taped beneath the wood, I found an envelope addressed to me in her handwriting. My name looked strange there, like a secret she'd finally allowed herself to write down. I sat on the floor before opening it, aware that once I did there would be no one knowing. Elaine's letter wasn't long. She didn't apologize. She explained. She said she hadn't told me, because she needed one part of her life to remain uncomplicated by risk. She said she loved me for being steady, for giving her a place where she didn't have to manage outcomes. She said she trusted me to do the right thing once the truth surfaced, even if that meant walking away from what she'd built. The choice, she wrote, would finally be mine. The instructions were precise, but incomplete. She outlined conditions under which funds could be released, warnings about people who might pressure me, and a single name I was told never to contact. That name was the same one on the account. I felt the room tilt slightly, as I understood that Elaine had planned for my refusal as carefully as she'd planned for my involvement. Either way, she had expected consequences. The phone rang again while I was still sitting there. This time it was the man from the cafe, his voice tighter than before. He said people were getting nervous. He said delays created rumors, and rumors attracted attention. I told him I needed time. He said time was the one thing Elaine had always controlled, and without her it was slipping. When the call ended, I felt something settle into place. Not resolve, responsibility. I looked around the house, at the life Elaine and I had shared, and understood that the quiet safety I'd believed in had always been subsidized by her vigilance elsewhere. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me afraid, because now that vigilance was expected of me, and I didn't yet know which part of this inherited role would hurt more, continuing what she started, or ending it, and letting everything she held together fall apart. I didn't sleep, not because of grief, but because decisions kept lining up in my head like dominoes, each one waiting for the slightest push. Elaine's letter sat on the table, folded again as if rereading it might change the meaning. I knew what people wanted from me, but I also knew what she had protected by keeping me out. The question wasn't whether I could step in. It was whether stepping in would erase the part of her life that had been honest. By morning light, the house felt smaller. I began making calls, not to the people who expected answers, but to those who could give me context without demands. Old colleagues of Elaine's, neighbors she trusted, names I found scribbled in margins. Some didn't answer. Others spoke cautiously, confirming pieces without ever naming the whole. Each conversation tightened the perimeter around the truth, and each one added a new risk I hadn't anticipated. One call ended abruptly when I mentioned the second name. The silence on the line was immediate, deliberate. The woman who had been speaking cleared her throat and said she couldn't help me anymore. She suggested I be careful, not careful in a general sense, but careful with who I allowed to believe I was in control. Control, she implied, was the currency Elaine had traded in, and it had value only while others believed in it. I realized then that word would spread. It always did. Elaine's absence was already creating gaps, and gaps attracted people who thrived on filling them. I locked the ledger away and removed the folder from my car. Visibility. Elaine had written, created leverage for others. I began to understand that her secrecy hadn't been about deception. It had been about limiting access to fear. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. A man stood there with a polite smile and an expression that never reached his eyes. He introduced himself as someone who had worked with Elaine on occasion. He spoke in generalities, praised her character, and then asked when operations would resume. The way he used that word made my skin prickle. I told him I was still sorting through her affairs. His smile tightened. He said, "Delays had consequences." After he left, I noticed my hands were steady. That surprised me. Fear was there, but it had sharpened into focus. I pulled out Elaine's instructions again, and followed them as best I could, verifying accounts, cross-checking initials, identifying patterns that suggested which obligations were most urgent. This wasn't instinct. It was triage. Elaine had trusted me to decide who could wait and who could not. The woman from the library called later, her tone more urgent. She said pressure was building from multiple sides. She warned me that some people would test boundaries to see if I'd bend. I asked her what Elaine would have done. There was a pause. Then she said Elaine would have already anticipated the test and neutralized it quietly. That answer didn't help. I wasn't Elaine. I was the variable she'd planned around. I made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. I authorized a limited release under the strictest conditions Elaine had outlined. Not enough to satisfy everyone, but enough to signal continuity. The response was immediate. Calls slowed, tension shifted. It worked, which frightened me more than failure would have. Success meant expectation, and expectation meant exposure. That evening I found another envelope hidden behind a loose panel in the hallway closet. This one wasn't addressed. Inside was a list of names, some crossed out, some underlined. At the bottom was the name Elaine had warned me never to contact. Seeing it written in her hand made my chest ache. Whatever that name represented, it was central enough to be acknowledged but dangerous enough to avoid. I understood then that Elaine hadn't just managed money. She'd managed people's worst moments, their desperation, their silence. By stepping into her place, even partially, I was inheriting not just her responsibilities, but her enemies. The house felt less like a refuge and more like a checkpoint. I wondered how long it would take before someone decided I was in the way. As night settled, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It contained a single sentence: "We know you opened the ledger." There was no threat attached, no demand, just confirmation. I sat down slowly, aware that whatever choices I made next would no longer be private, and that Elaine's careful balance was already tipping towards something far less forgiving. I deleted the message without replying, then turned the phone off entirely. Elaine had written that silence could be a tool, if used briefly and deliberately. I hoped she was right. I walked through the house, checking locks I had never thought about before, closing curtains that usually stayed open. Each small action felt like an admission that safety had become conditional. Sitting at the table again, I mapped out what little leverage I had: accounts, instructions, relationships I barely understood. I could continue releasing funds and risk drawing closer scrutiny, or I could freeze everything and force confrontation. Neither option promised safety. Both promised escalation. I chose neither, at least not yet. Delay, Elaine had shown me, could be an active choice. Near midnight, a car slowed outside the house, headlights pausing just long enough to be noticed before moving on. It might have been nothing. It might not have been. I didn't look through the window. I focused instead on Elaine's handwriting, on the steadiness of her lines, and tried to borrow some of that calm. I woke with the uneasy sense that someone else had been awake all night on my behalf. The house felt altered, not violated but observed, as if attention itself had weight. I checked the doors, the windows, the car, finding nothing disturbed, That absence was its own message. Elaine had once told me that when people wanted something badly enough, they preferred you alert, not alarmed. Alert people made choices. Alarmed people called for help. I turned my phone back on and watched messages arrive in careful sequence. None demanded anything outright. Each hinted, each referenced delays, expectations, understanding. One included a photograph of the library cafe from the outside, taken from across the street. It wasn't threatening. It was precise. I deleted it, then restored it, then deleted it again, finally understanding that proof mattered more than denial. I decided to meet the woman again, but on my terms. I chose a place Elaine favored for neutrality, a municipal building with open space and quiet corners. When she arrived, she looked relieved and wary at the same time. I told her I would continue limited releases, only if conditions were honored. No pressure visits, no new participants, no changes without notice. She listened, then said those rules would anger certain people. I said anger was preferable to panic. She warned me about the underlined name. I asked her to explain without naming it. She said it represented enforcement, the moment when quiet arrangements became loud corrections. Elaine had kept that door closed by making herself indispensable. Without her, others might try to open it. The implications sat between us, heavy and unfinished. Back home, I opened the ledger again, this time searching for patterns of omission. I noticed entries that stopped abruptly, initials that appeared only once, amounts returned with no explanation. Elaine had intervened selectively. She had chosen when not to help as carefully as when to help. That discretion, I realized, was the true asset. Money was just the instrument. A call came from an unfamiliar number, the voice calm, professional. The speaker said he represented interests affected by recent decisions. He asked if I intended to maintain Elaine's commitments. I said I intended to honor her principles. He paused, then asked whose principles those were now. The question lingered after the call ended, like a hook catching fabric. I made another decision, smaller but sharper. I froze one account entirely, citing verification. The reaction was immediate and uneven. Some accepted it, others pushed. One message contained a threat disguised as concern. I forwarded it to the woman and told her that was the line. She replied that lines were useful, only if defended. As evening approached, I found a final envelope tucked inside Elaine's winter coat pocket. It was thin and addressed simply, "If they come to the house." Inside was a sequence of steps. None dramatic, all practical. Contacts to notify, accounts to lock. A note, reminding me to stay visible. Isolation, she wrote. Invited force. I followed the steps. Calling 2 people Elaine trusted to bear witness without interference. They arrived quietly, sat with me, asked nothing. Their presence steadied the room. When a car passed slowly outside again, it did not stop. Visibility worked. Later, alone again, I confronted the truth I had avoided. Elaine had not just protected others. She had controlled escalation. By stepping in, I was not replacing her. I was changing the equation. People who had tolerated her boundaries might test mine. People she had restrained might move faster. The phone rang once more, late enough to feel intentional. The voice on the line said only, "We expected Elaine," I replied. "You have me." Silence followed, then a low acknowledgement. The call ended without resolution, without threat. It felt like the first move in a longer game. I sat at the table, the ledger closed, the instructions memorized, understanding that every choice narrowed future choices. Elaine had trusted me with that narrowing. Whether it would end in collapse or correction remained uncertain. What was certain was that Tuesday would come again, and this time the habit would be mine. I stood and paced, measuring the distance between windows, practicing the calm Elaine valued. I imagined her doing the same, Years earlier, deciding which risk to absorb. The thought steadied me. I wrote notes, not plans, because plans hardened too soon. Notes could bend. I reviewed the conditions again, adjusting language to remove ambiguity, knowing ambiguity invited exploitation. Another message arrived, shorter than the others. It asked for a meeting with the underlined name's proxy, not the name itself. That distinction mattered. It meant negotiation was still possible. I did not answer immediately. I prepared instead, assembling documentation that demonstrated continuity without submission. Elaine had taught this by example, even without my knowing it. When I finally replied, I set boundaries, and a public venue included witnesses by implication and limited duration. The response came quickly, agreeing to terms while proposing a different hour. I declined the change. Minutes passed. Acceptance followed. Control, I learned, could be reclaimed in inches. I slept lightly, dreams fragmented, but woke without dread. That surprised me. Dread had been replaced by focus. I understood that the secret Elaine left me was not money or leverage, but a method: stay predictable, reduce noise, and choose where to stand. With that, I gathered the folder, locked the house, and prepared to step into the day that would decide whether this inheritance ended with me or transformed into something safer. As I reached the door, my phone buzzed once, a calendar reminder Elaine had set long ago, Tuesday. I turned it off, not in denial, but in acknowledgement. The ritual no longer belonged to the bank alone. It belonged to the choices that followed, and to the unresolved reckoning waiting beyond them. I stepped outside knowing observation had resumed, consequences were approaching, and whatever protection Elaine built would soon demand a visible, costly answer. Now, I arrived early to the meeting place, a public atrium, attached to a government building, all glass and echo, designed to make secrecy uncomfortable. I chose a bench in full view of the security desk and sat with my hands visible, posture neutral, the way Elaine used to sit when she wanted to signal cooperation without submission. The folder rested beside me, unopened, its presence intentional. People noticed objects before words. The proxy arrived precisely on time. He was older than I expected, dressed plainly, carrying nothing. He did not introduce himself. He sat, angled slightly away, as if proximity itself required restraint. He said, Elaine had been respected because she understood limits. I replied that limits were the only reason I had agreed to meet. The exchange set the tone, careful and brittle. He spoke first about continuity, then about disruption, framing both as inevitabilities rather than choices. He said certain arrangements had depended on Elaine's discretion, and that her absence created risk for everyone involved. I listened without interrupting, letting the atrium's openness flatten his authority. When he paused, I said I would not replace Elaine, and I would not expand what she built. I would only stabilize it long enough to close it properly. The proxy studied me, then asked if I understood the consequences of closure. I said I understood the consequences of prolongation better. That answer surprised him. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging a shift he hadn't anticipated. He asked about the underlined name, without saying it. I said that door would remain closed unless opened by law, not leverage. The words felt heavier leaving my mouth. But they landed. He leaned back, eyes tracking movement in the atrium, calculating visibility. He said, Elaine had always planned for endings, not just continuations. He said some people would resist that ending. I said resistance would be managed by reducing exposure, not by confrontation. He asked how I intended to do that. I slid a single page from the folder, outlining a wind-down schedule with firm dates and clear conditions. No negotiations, no accelerations. He read silently. The silence stretched. I resisted the urge to fill it. Elaine had written that silence, when chosen, forced others to reveal their priorities. Finally, he said the schedule was aggressive. I said it was humane. Aggression, I added, came from uncertainty, not timelines. He returned the page and said he would convey the terms. Convey, not agree. That distinction mattered. When he stood to leave, he said something that stayed with me. Elaine trusted you with the last move. He did not explain. He did not need to. I watched him walk away into the open space, blending into the public flow. The meeting had ended without threats, without promises. That, I realized, was progress. Back home, I implemented the schedule immediately. Accounts were locked in phases, notifications sent with language. Elaine favored plain, respectful, final. I documented every step, not for defense, but for clarity. Confusion had been Elaine's enemy. Transparency, when controlled, had been her shield. I understood now why she had avoided telling me. Knowledge created responsibility, and responsibility narrowed lives. Calls came in waves. Some angry, some relieved. A few grateful in ways that suggested genuine relief rather than opportunism. I responded selectively, repeating the same sentences until they lost their sharpness. Repetition created predictability. Predictability reduced panic. By evening, the noise softened. The woman from the library checked in. Her tone measured. She said some expected a reversal. I said expectations would adjust. She asked if I was safe. I said safety was a process, not a state. She laughed quietly, a sound that carried both fatigue and respect. Lyswood. Whose Elaine would have liked that answer. As night fell, I reviewed the remaining risks. One stood out: the underlined name's interest would not disappear simply because the door stayed closed. Pressure would shift, become indirect. Elaine had anticipated that too. In the back of her letter, a postscript I had overlooked addressed escalation without confrontation. It advised creating witnesses through routine, making presence boring rather than provocative. I set reminders for mundane tasks, public appearances, predictable errands. Boredom, she wrote, was armor. I followed that advice. Over the next stretch of hours, I made myself visible in ordinary ways, walking the same route, shopping at the same store, sitting in the same cafe. No secrecy, no drama. Messages slowed further. When one arrived hinting at impatience, I replied with the schedule again. Consistency answered questions better than arguments. Late that night, I sat in the living room, with Elaine's coat draped over the chair. I thought about the last move the proxy mentioned. It occurred to me then that Elaine had trusted me not to win, but to end. Winning invited retaliation. Ending invited relief. The difference was subtle, but it defined everything she'd built. I drafted a final notice, brief and careful, announcing the closure date and the conditions under which remaining balances would be resolved. I circulated it through the same quiet channels Elaine used, avoiding any language that suggested blame or fear. The responses were immediate and mixed, but none crossed the lines I had drawn. Near midnight, a message arrived acknowledging receipt and acceptance of the schedule. No signature, no flourish, just acceptance. I sat back, the tension easing a fraction, aware that acceptance did not mean forgiveness or forgetting. It meant the system had adjusted. I slept, finally. Not deeply, but enough. In the early morning, I woke with a sense of direction rather than dread. The ending Elaine had planned was underway, and it required vigilance, not heroics. I checked the locks, reviewed the schedule, and prepared for the final phase. As I stepped outside, the world looked unchanged, which was the point. Elaine's secret had never been about spectacle. It had been about control without cruelty. If I could honor that, then the last move would belong not to those who demanded it, but to the quiet choices that closed doors without slamming them. The closure schedule began to work its way through the system like a slow tide, exposing things Elaine had long kept submerged. Each confirmation I received carried a different tone: resignation, irritation, relief, but none challenged the premise that this was ending. That collective acceptance made me uneasy. Elaine had warned that the most dangerous moments came not with resistance, but with apparent compliance. Compliance created space, and space invited last moves. I kept to the routines she had outlined. Same cafe, same table, same order, same walk home, same nods to neighbors who had begun to look at me differently, as if sensing I carried news they were not meant to hear. I spoke to no one about details. I spoke about weather, about traffic, about nothing at all. Boredom, as Elaine promised, dulled curiosity, but it did not erase intent. Midway through the wind down, I noticed a discrepancy. A transfer had been authorized under my conditions, but the receiving account did not match the ledger. The amount was small enough to escape casual scrutiny, large enough to signal a probe. Someone was testing whether I was watching closely or relying on process alone. I froze the account immediately and issued a neutral inquiry. The response came quickly, apologetic, explanatory, too smooth. I did not release the funds. The woman from the library called that evening. She said pressure was shifting again, moving sideways rather than forward. She said some people were unhappy with the pace, and others with the finality. I told her both reactions were expected. Fords, she asked if I had contingency plans. I said I had Elaine's, and that I was learning when not to use them. At home, I reviewed the underlined name's absence. No direct contact. No proxies. That silence felt deliberate now. Not restrained. It suggested waiting. Elaine's postscript echoed in my head. When the door stays closed long enough, those who want it open will try another entrance. I began to inventory entrances. Social, legal, reputational, and closed them preemptively where I could. A letter arrived by mail, formal and heavy with implication, suggesting irregularities that could attract attention if unresolved. It did not accuse. It invited discussion. The stationery was expensive, the timing precise. I recognized it as a pressure tactic dressed as compliance. I responded in writing, referencing the schedule, attaching documentation, and copying a neutral third party Elaine had named as a stabilizer. The reply came 2 days later, courteous, withdrawing the invitation. Another inch reclaimed. As the final date approached, my phone rang less often, but when it did, the voices carried urgency beneath politeness. I repeated the same sentences, aware that repetition was now my signature. Predictability had become my authority. Elaine would have approved of that. She had never raised her voice. She had raised expectations and met them consistently. Then something changed. A neighbor mentioned a car that had been parked down the street at odd hours. Another asked if everything was all right, saying people had been asking questions. Not my name, the house. The pattern felt familiar, like reconnaissance done by those who preferred distance. I adjusted routine slightly, not to hide, but to observe. The car disappeared. A different one appeared. Then none at all. The day before the final releases, I received a message with no sender, no greeting. It read, "Last chance to reconsider." I did not reply. I forwarded it to the neutral party and logged the time. Elaine's notes emphasized documentation, not as evidence, but as deterrence. People behaved differently when they knew patterns were recorded. That night, sleep came late and light. I dreamed of Elaine standing at the bank counter, calm, waiting, her reflection steady in the glass. I woke with resolve, rather than fear. The ending was hers, but the execution was mine. On the morning of the final phase, I dressed plainly and went to the cafe. The same table, the same coffee. I opened my laptop and initiated the last releases under the conditions set. Notifications went out. Confirmations returned. One by one, accounts closed, obligations resolved, balances returned to their rightful owners or their representatives. The system exhaled. An hour later, the woman called. Her voice softer than I had heard it before. She said it was done. She said Elaine would have been satisfied. When I thanked her, and ended the call, feeling neither triumph nor relief, only a narrowing of tension. Endings did that. They made space for consequences. I walked home slowly, noticing ordinary details with heightened clarity. The house greeted me as it always had. I checked the locks, set the folder aside, and sat at the table, for the first time since Elaine's death. There was nothing immediate to decide. That absence felt unfamiliar. The phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The voice was calm, controlled, unmistakably authoritative. He did not introduce himself. He said the closure had been noted. He said some doors closed quietly, others left marks. He said Elaine had been effective. He said I had been efficient. The word choice unsettled me. Efficiency was not Elaine's goal. He asked what I intended to do next. I said I intended to live quietly. He paused, then said quiet lives sometimes attracted unfinished business. I asked if this was a threat. He said it was an observation. The line went dead. I sat there, the room unchanged, understanding that while Elaine's system had ended, its shadow had not. Ending reduced risk. It did not erase it. The final move, I realized, was not closure, but vigilance after closure, a quieter, longer watch. I gathered the remaining papers and placed them in a box, labeling it simply. I did not destroy them. Elaine had never destroyed records. She believed memory, even inconvenient memory, prevented repetition. I stored the box out of sight, but not out of reach. As evening fell, a car passed the house once, then did not return. The street settled into its usual rhythm. I allowed myself a single breath of relief, knowing better than to mistake it for safety. Elaine's secret had ended, but the lesson remained, unresolved and active, waiting for the moment it would be tested again. I tried to return to ordinary life, but ordinary resisted me with small, persistent frictions everywhere. Neighbors smiled longer. Shop clerks lingered. Conversations paused when I entered rooms, then resumed carefully. Elaine's absence had created an outline people filled with speculation. I followed routines anyway, believing predictability would drain interest. It worked unevenly. Some attention faded, some sharpened. I sensed a question forming in the background, less about money than about authority. Who decided endings now? The thought followed me home each evening, where quiet stretched thin and patience learned to hold steady, watchful, cautious, deliberate, unprovoked, measured, contained there. The box of documents stayed unopened for days, an agreement I made with myself. I would not feed the past unless the present demanded it. Still, messages arrived, indirect but insistent, suggesting meetings, clarifications, mutual understanding. I declined politely, repeatedly, citing closure. Each refusal tested resolve. Elaine's handwriting returned to me in flashes, reminding me restraint was action. One afternoon, a reporter called, asking about community financial assistance rumors. I said nothing substantive, redirected, and documented the contact. Silence. When consistent, reshaped narratives without spectacle, without drama, without concession, through repetition, patience, timing, boundaries, steadiness, visibility, routine, resolve, control, maintained. Then a mistake surfaced, subtle and human. A clerk released a notice too broadly, revealing a summary that invited interpretation. The response was immediate. Emails multiplied, questions sharpened. I corrected the error publicly, owned it and restated terms without defensiveness. Accountability cooled speculation faster than secrecy ever had. Elaine had understood that. Later, the woman from the library warned me of resentment brewing among those who preferred shadows. I thanked her and adjusted nothing. Adjustment signaled weakness. Consistency signaled inevitability. which people respected even when they disliked it deeply. Privately, reluctantly, quietly, persistently, collectively, predictably, plainly, firmly, calmly, patiently. Enough. A week later, a letter arrived from a regulatory office, neutral in tone, requesting information. This was expected. I responded promptly, attaching records, timelines, and confirmations. Transparency transformed the request into routine. The office replied, satisfied, closing the inquiry. Word traveled. Pressure eased. Those who thrived on ambiguity retreated. Those who sought closure accepted it. I felt the system settle, not collapse. Elaine's final move revealed itself as reputational insulation, built slowly through fairness. Is ending well mattered as much as beginning carefully, perhaps more than anyone admitted publicly afterward. Quietly, consistently, patiently, deliberately, steadily, responsibly forward together, apart somehow. Always, despite progress, an unease remained, less external than internal. I questioned my own motives, wondering whether stewardship had hardened into control. Elaine had balanced compassion with limits. I feared leaning too far either way. To recalibrate, I met with the neutral party she named, reviewed outcomes, invited critique. The feedback was blunt and helpful. Close faster. Communicate earlier. Preserve dignity. I revised the final notices accordingly. The response improved. Relief appeared in voices I hadn't expected. Closure, done well. Reduced harm rather than redistributed it across communities. Relationships, reputations, futures, systems, processes, people, families, neighbors, institutions, quietly, responsibly, humanely, enough. One evening, I found myself at the bank, not to transact, but to observe. The lobby hummed with ordinary business. No one recognized me. That anonymity felt earned. I sat briefly, then left, understanding rituals could end without replacement. Outside, the sky held steady light. I thought of Elaine's Tuesdays and released them. Habits, she taught me, were tools, not vows. Tools could be set down. I drove home without stopping, untracked, unremarked, carrying nothing but the calm that comes from finishing properly, carefully, quietly, fully, decisively, finally, patiently, thoughtfully, responsibly, deliberately, steadily, humanely, respectfully, inwardly, outwardly, together, alone now. The call I expected eventually came, brief and courteous. It acknowledged compliance, noted learning, and suggested distance. I welcome distance. Distance protected everyone. Afterward, I archived the last files and informed witnesses the process had concluded. They responded with relief and gratitude, then returned to their lives. That mattered. Elaine's work had always aimed to restore normalcy, not dependency. Ending created space for others to stand independently. I stood too, feeling lighter, aware vigilance would continue quietly, but without the weight of unfinished obligations remaining, residual, inherited, implied, anticipated, remembered, acknowledged, measured, balanced, bounded, limited, acceptable, sustainable, ordinary, shared, resolved. Grief returned unexpectedly, gentler but persistent, as structure dissolved, without tasks. Memory surfaced. I missed Elaine's laugh, her precision, her patience. I missed not knowing. That surprised me. Knowledge had changed us. Still, I honored her by choosing simplicity. I donated her coats, kept her notes, planted something living in the yard. Growth felt appropriate. Neighbors noticed the garden and commented. Conversation returned to safe subjects. Life resumed. Not unchanged, but steadier, less charged. willing to move forward again, carefully, patiently, honestly, quietly, deliberately, kindly, thoughtfully, gently, responsibly, predictably, steadily, hopefully, modestly, practically, calmly, openly, together nearby, onward, always, enough. On a clear morning I opened the box once more, not from need but from closure. I reviewed the documents, confirmed completion and shredded copies as appropriate, preserving originals securely. This balance felt right. Memory without leverage. Record without threat. I sealed the box and labeled it with a date only. No names, no explanations. Then I stored it away. Elaine had believed that future selves deserved clarity without burden. I agreed. The past could be known without being carried daily anymore, forward, peacefully, quietly, thoughtfully, deliberately, responsibly, safely, respectfully, privately, inwardly, outwardly, together, apart, accepted, resolved, finished, closed, complete. Tuesdays arrived and left unnoticed. That finally felt like success. I lived smaller and truer, attentive to ordinary obligations. The house settled into itself. Elaine's presence softened into guidance rather than command. When questions surfaced, I answered simply. When silence was wiser, I held it. The secret had ended without spectacle, the ending without victory. What remained was a quieter inheritance, judgment, restraint, and the courage to finish well. I carried that forward, alert but unafraid, ordinary again. Today, tomorrow, continually, steadily, patiently, responsibly, quietly, thoughtfully, humanely, honestly, deliberately, modestly, calmly, openly, inwardly, outwardly, together, apart, resolved, complete. I thought closure would feel loud, like a door slamming, but it arrived quietly, almost apologetically, the way truth sometimes does after it finishes rearranging your life. I sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, listening to the refrigerator hum, realizing that endings rarely announce themselves, and that Elaine had always preferred results over declarations. The house held steady, neither forgiving nor accusing, just present, waiting for me to decide what kind of man I would be without her guidance. I breathed slowly, accepting that calm was earned, not granted, and that vigilance could coexist with peace, if I chose. I returned to routines not as armor, but as acknowledgement that ordinary life deserved attention again. I paid bills, watered plants, called my son, and listened without steering the conversation. He spoke about work, about plans, about nothing dangerous. I felt the temptation to warn him, to share the weight I had carried, but restraint honored Elaine's intent. Knowledge could bruise when offered without need. After the call, I wrote a letter to myself, promising restraint, patience, and honesty, then sealed it away, trusting future clarity more than immediate relief. I noticed my hands were steady, my thoughts quieter, my resolve. The town resumed its rhythm, and I blended back into it with intention. I stood in grocery lines, attended a small meeting, smiled at neighbors. The absence of pressure felt unfamiliar, like silence after a storm. Yet I remembered Elaine's caution. Peace invited complacency. I kept records tidy, communications brief, and appearances predictable. Predictability was not weakness. It was the removal of drama. In that removal, attention faded. Rumors lost oxygen. The extraordinary became ordinary again. I learned to appreciate boredom as a form of safety, a daily proof that endings could be gentle if protected by discipline and time. Grief arrived later, unannounced, during a morning of nothing special. It rose while I folded laundry, a simple wave that reminded me endings did not erase love. I let it pass without resistance. Elaine had been careful with emotions, not avoidant. She believed feelings belonged, but they did not get to drive. I honored that belief by allowing sadness without surrendering direction. When it softened, I felt gratitude instead of relief, and understood that grief, like vigilance, could be carried lightly if acknowledged honestly and set down deliberately. I visited the bank once more, not for business, but for symmetry. The lobby looked smaller than memory suggested. I waited briefly, then left without approaching a counter. Outside, the air felt open. The ritual ended without ceremony, which felt right. Tools could be retired. Habits could dissolve. I did not replace Tuesdays with anything else. I let them become ordinary days again, a quiet victory. Elaine would have appreciated. Ending did not require a substitute. It required acceptance, reinforced by consistency and restraint. The box remained stored, labeled simply, untouched. I understood its presence as a promise, not a threat. Memory mattered. Leverage did not. I kept copies where appropriate and destroyed excess with care. The balance felt ethical. Elaine believed records protected truth without enabling harm. I practiced that balance, knowing future questions might arise. Preparedness was not paranoia. It was respect for complexity, and for the people who could be affected by careless certainty. I chose to remain ready without remaining afraid. Weeks passed. Life expanded gently. I joined a walking group, planted more in the yard, learned the names of neighbors I had overlooked. Ordinary connections grounded me. They reminded me why endings mattered: to return power to communities, not concentrate it. Elaine had worked quietly so others could stand without her. I followed that example by stepping back when I could, forward only when necessary. The measure of success became invisibility, paired with integrity, a combination that protected everyone involved. One evening, a message arrived from an unknown number, neutral in tone, acknowledging the closure and requesting no further contact. I did not reply. Acceptance did not require acknowledgement. The silence felt final, but not triumphant. It felt adult. I archived the message and continued cooking dinner. Power, I learned, was the ability to continue ordinary tasks without interruption, without reaction, without spectacle, after extraordinary responsibility had been discharged with care and restraint. I sat with Elaine's photograph and spoke aloud, not asking questions, not seeking permission, just sharing the quiet. I thanked her for trust and for the discipline she taught me without words. I promised to keep endings clean and beginnings modest. I promised to remain attentive. The room listened without answering. That was enough. Some conversations were complete when spoken, not when resolved. As night settled, I recognized the last unresolved danger was internal, forgetting the lesson because peace felt comfortable. I chose not to forget. I chose to remember lightly. To keep watch without searching. To live without inviting the past to reassert itself. Elaine's secret ended, but responsibility did not. It transformed into judgment, restraint, and care, carried forward quietly, ready if called, invisible if not, complete yet vigilant, finished yet awake, ordinary and prepared at the same time.